So good evening and welcome. My name is Erin O'Connor. I'm Managing Director of Contemporary Calgary, and I'm delighted that you have chosen to be here on this freezing cold night. Thank you. We are here to listen to a conversation between three very thoughtful, interesting, and intelligent men, each with a background that is immense in art and art making. Also, each one of them with an interest and affinity for discourse on arts and culture. So we're in for a treat here. I'm sure there'll be some sparks. Robert Enright, on the end here, is Senior Contributing Editor and Film Critic for Border Crossings magazine and the University Research Chair in Art Theory and Criticism in the School of Fine Art and Music at the University of Guelph. Jeffrey Spalding is an artist, writer, and curator, and we're delighted that he could join us, just back from China. I'm sure we'll hear some about his trip. And Kim Dorland in the middle, sitting duck in the middle, maybe, who knows? Don't mean to set that up, but is clearly a dedicated and accomplished artist. All you have to do is look around and look at the visuals behind and beside us here to know that he is clearly an accomplished artist. So we are in for a treat here. Following their conversation, there will be opportunity for all of us to join in the dialogue. So if you have a burning question, save it. There will be question and answer at the end. And if everybody is ready, we will now begin.
Well, thank you. And indeed, my name is David Frost, and I'm... this is an extraordinary opportunity for me to be in the company of these two dudes. They're quite legendary in their own way, and Erin has already given the introduction, so I won't wax eloquent anymore. But simply, I couldn't possibly start this in the company of our great artist, whose work is here, but in the company as well of Robert Enright, without paying the compliment that we're in the company with Robert, who has done this wonderful interview with Kim for the book. Do you see how I'm shilling for the book already, right? You know, you have to buy the book. But Robert has done this wonderful interview with Kim for the book, because among other things, he has been one of our primary legendary figures in art history over the last 20 years, and has conducted interviews and published interviews by and about phenomenal other artists. Welcome and thank you for being here in Calgary.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. I always like coming to Calgary because I always see good work here, and I haven't been here before, so I'm particularly pleased, and I want to thank the institution for inviting me. And also, you know, we have to all congratulate one another. It is remarkable to be here. I've known this guy for talk about legends when he was at Lethbridge longer ago than either of us care to remember. So it's actually interesting, and maybe this is the right show for a kind of reflection on the notion of there being an actual art history in this country. The interesting thing is, because it's a relatively new country, and I see artists in the audience as well, I mean, we're making the art history as we go. And I think that the thing that I've been privileged to be able to do as an art critic is to make the interview my primary form of discourse. I do write reviews and essays, and I take other ways of talking about art. But the most interesting thing for me is to be able to go into the studios of artists and talk to them about what it is they do. I was remarking earlier that think if Vasari, and don't get me wrong here, I'm not comparing myself to Vasari, but he managed to go into studios and come out with this remarkable ability to kind of recollect what those great Renaissance masters told him. I have the advantage of being able to go in with a tape recorder, so I don't have to even write. I don't have a quill pen. I don't know how he wrote that fast. My guess is actually that Vasari was also a fiction writer, and that maybe what we're getting from him is also a kind of interpretation of the work and not merely a reflection on what the artists have told him. But we'll never know that. What we've got instead of the lives of the artists and architects, and it's a pretty extraordinary book. So the reason why I'm here is because over the course of now, I don't know how long, Kim, probably 12 years? How long have we been at this how long have I been talking at you about your work now?
Maybe a little less, maybe like 8 or 9.
8 or 9?
Yeah.
I mean, it started that long ago, and in the book, the interview that is conducted with him is actually an idea I stole from David Sylvester when he spoke with Francis Bacon over the course of actually 40 years, in which it's really based on 4 interviews that were done at different times, and so I just basically collaged them together in ways that made, I hope, sense of what it is that Kim says about his work. If there are any art historians in the room, I'm deeply apologetic. I know that that's considered anathema, because what Kim said about color in 2007 may be different from what he says about color in 2014, but in a way I don't care about that. What I care about is what he says about color and the way that you can build that into a kind of narrative of criticism, which is very useful. So my great privilege has been able to talk to him now already 4 times about different bodies of work, and the final time less than only about a year ago in Toronto, when after the show had gone up with McMichael. So that's why I'm here, and my contribution to the book is being able to be tolerated by artists and ask them pertinent questions about their process, and having them actually answer the questions I ask. I think that that's kind of a gift.
Yeah, let me jump in with that and just say that on the occasion of the observation you're making, I want to also acknowledge and welcome Richard Nadeau from Figure One, who's the publisher of the Kim Dorland book. And the Kim Dorland book was a collaboration with the McMichael Canadian Collection in Kleinburg, and it's did I say that already? It's available for sale tonight. Yeah, so I think we did mention that. But in many ways, that was the start of the notion and the idea that we might do a show together. Yes. But actually, we very quickly transitioned that, and we transitioned it to this particular exhibition that I think are very proud of. I hope you've enjoyed it. But I want to ask him to make his reflections as a Alberta kid coming home.
Well, initially the idea was to do a version of the McMichael show, which quickly we sort of realized so much of my work came from this place. I think we could make a show that suited this space, right, the audience a lot more. So even when you're doing a show at a commercial gallery, it's nice to think about your audience, and generally speaking, your audience, it doesn't dictate what you do, but it is a piece of the puzzle when you're putting a show together. So it was really nice to be able to bring this work back home, really. And some of these paintings, the first time they were exhibited, the Loner, the trampoline painting upstairs, and a few others, the Bush Party paintings downstairs, they were actually first exhibited here at a gallery in Calgary. Yes. Anyway, so it was nice to sort of bring them back and then to fill in the pieces over the years and make a show that I think suits the province in a weird way. And then also, because my own practice was sort of doing this roundabout thing, I had done a lot of this work, and then I was sort of lost in the woods for a long time, and I'm not putting one group of work over the other. Right. They're all part of the puzzle. But I was sort of going back to this work. So the timing was actually really good.
But it also, it's not just a reflective. I mean, certainly you were born here, you were brought up here, you were educated here, you had challenges here. And you survived those challenges, and you made paintings about those challenges.
Barely.
But actually, we're sitting around in the company of 2 massive paintings that are just recently made, and they seem to be reflective of here as well.
Yeah, so am I yelling? Is this really loud? It's all good. It's okay?
It's good, you're good.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so I wanted to do some new work for the show, and it happened that we came here to see the space, and so much of my work then was about reflecting back on my time in Alberta, and this was literally just sort of looking at my time while I was in Alberta, because I still feel deeply connected to the physical space of Alberta, even though I don't live here anymore.
Right.
So it's still, in a weird sort of way, feels like home to me.
And what's interesting is that what you two have been able to do is this is a profoundly different show
Yes.
than the one at the McMichael. I
Yes.
mean, I was surprised to come in today to see how much this is a distinct and discrete show.
Yeah.
So, and I gather you wanted that. You didn't want to do any kind of an iteration of what had happened at the McMichael.
Yeah, it immediately felt wrong. And so, and the McMichael show was totally right for the McMichael. It was great.
Yeah.
It was a wonderful show, and I'm not putting that show down.
Right.
But I just think that we made a really smart decision bringing this body of work here.
Well, we also made a strange decision as well, because despite the fact that you're from here and that many people will know some of your work, other people didn't know your work that well.
Yes.
And so it was a bit of a risk, and I think we still did fine. I hope everyone will agree that we did fine by not bringing Kim Dorland's greatest hits.
Yes.
We brought a different kind of show.
Yes.
And in a way, that's kind of.
Am I old enough to have greatest hits?
Yeah, you are. And but also the thing is that I'm also sneaky enough to know that that if I did the greatest hits, there would be no sequel to the exhibition, right? And I'd be out of work. So instead, we did this particular show, which leaves the opportunity for a more inclusive, overview at some other stage.
Yeah.
But anyway, enough of all that stuff. What I'd like to get back to here is that that's kind of the motif that I would like to approach here, is that the motivation that we shared in making the exhibition was about reflection on not Alberta, but about your relationship with Alberta, and more specifically your relationship with your family, your life, and your situation. And quite clearly that's changed. So I'm interested at this stage in terms of you looking back at the work, where Kim Dorland is as we sit today in relation to Alberta.
Wildly happy. It's interesting. I was saying to Robert earlier, we were going through the show. Most of these works, except for maybe the newer works, I'm no longer the maker. I'm actually the viewer. They're far enough away from me that I can look at them and I can experience them and I can remember making them, but they're so far back now with time that I'm more able to sort of look at them in a detached way. Does that answer your question at all?
Well, yes, it does.
And it's like Red Deer, it's like Alberta. These works, in a way, especially the older works like 2006, 7, 8, they were really a detached. It was a detached kind of reflection on my time in this crazy place that was so intense that I had to work it out somehow. But then there's always also the material concerns of what I'm doing.
Right.
So in a way that remains constant. That's the constant of the work, is the material.
Well, but also with particularly the Alberta-related works, it is an autobiography in some way or other?
Yeah. Yes. So, I mean, this has been written about and spoken about a lot, but it didn't come.
But not necessarily everyone in the audience has heard.
So I had painted I'd left Alberta. I did my first year of college here. I went to Vancouver with my wife, and I then moved to Toronto. And I was always good at painting. I was a convincing painter in whatever style I chose to work with, but it didn't really come together for me until I realized that I wanted to tell my own story. And the first part of that story for me was really about reflecting on my time as a teenager in Red Deer. So that was that work.
Which is
so there's
by this
Eastview Sev and the alley behind my wife's place, and the bush parties, etc. And so then the way that some of the newer works work is that I don't really need to look back with nostalgia anymore. I've kind of got enough going on in my immediate life to sort of keep me busy narratively. Family dynamics, how relationships are nothing like you think they're going to be. Like all of that kind of pregnant drama is what I'm looking at now, but still with the same material concerns. So it's...
It's interesting to me that one of the things that became apparent to me in seeing the show here was that you were able to, for me as a viewer, I was freed from the reliance on filtering the paintings through the group and Emily Carr and David Milne. I mean, one of the things that the McMichael show did, I don't know if many of you saw it brilliantly, and properly so, because Kim, as Jeffrey noted in his essay and is in the interview, is probably one of the most generous artists in talking about his completely recognized relationship to the tradition of painting. One of the things you find in talking about a lot of painters is they never want to talk about who they're looking at. It's a kind of proprietorial thing, or it's some notion, a modernist notion of originality. The simple truth with Kim is he's a magpie, and he's picking up all the pretty things everywhere he finds them. And in fact, I think actually most painters do that, and that's this tradition that one inevitably and inescapably enters if you're going to be a painter. I mean, painting is both the most vexed and the most magnificent of the art forms, for all reasons that are good and bad. It's a pain in the ass because it is the master narrative, and all the language which has come down to us through art history is applicable and has to be wrestled with all the time. The interesting thing for this show is that I now am able to see these works. I mean, when we were looking at this, how about this one behind? I mean, the first thing I thought of was not, for instance, David Milne or Tom Thompson, but the Highway 401, the great painting by Jack Chambers. I mean, this is, and my guess is somewhere in your retinal memory. And I think this is the way it works. I don't think it's about direct quotation. I think it's about a kind of recognition that may come to you after the thing is made rather than in the making of the thing itself.
Well, I recognize that not before, but during the making.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and I mean, sometimes it is looking to somebody or something that influences you and working with it directly from the get-go. Yeah. And sometimes you recognize halfway through, like, oh, sure. You know, Jack Chambers' amazing painting of the 401 is totally reflective of this. Or even you could go further and Doig's amazing DBP painting with the rainbow. I mean, it's not directly like that, but
the difference is you would never want to eat a Doig painting. You certainly, there's nothing to eat on a Chambers painting. I couldn't resist sticking my nose in those clouds, man. Those are the best. Those should be cake icing, those clouds. I mean, I think that's a rather extraordinary thing.
That's lead paint. You'll be in big trouble.
That's a lot. That's right. But I mean, one of the things you do, which is really interesting, and again comes out in the show, is I don't know any painter who gets as much mark-making mileage out of a single painting. I mean, there's about 30 different ways of applying paint in any one of your paintings. Is that a deliberate, I mean, is that the way you inescapably make paintings? You can't do it any other way?
It's what makes the act of making interesting for me. And it's always been, how do you make a painting that you can sink into and recognize as a space, but how can you also push the viewer back as hard as you can and make them recognize every single component in that space? And then if they're willing to dig any deeper, they'll start to recognize different things like, you know, the thing that's farthest back is actually the thickest, you know.
Perspectival.
Yeah, and so there's this whole kind of mind game that I'm playing for the audience. But, you know, initially that audience is me. So I'm making them fun for myself to make and view, and then hopefully I can send them into the world and other people will get as much, you know. I want them to be beautiful. I think that's really obvious, but I also want them to be really challenging. And, you know, the death of painting is beauty. So how do you make things that are beautiful but repellent at the same time? That sounds very droll, but
that's pretty good.
I actually like making them.
This probably should have been the last question. So you know, here we are in the early going.
It's going to be a short evening.
Short evening. But we're in the neighborhood of a very new painting. And everyone who's looking at it, I hope, would agree that it's not only a very impressive painting, but it's unquestionably a Kim Dorland painting. but actually it's quite different than some of the other works in the exhibition. Even like directly across from us, same size. And even in the direct methodology, physically, in reality, you've actually covered up almost all of the fluorescent, which used to be made, you know, can I say that? Sort of like your signature style?
I guess so, yeah.
Right? I mean, it is the way that almost like, my grandmother used to start every meal by just simply cutting up onions and starting frying them, you know, and then dinner would occur somehow thereafter. With your paintings, it seemed like you always started with an underpainting of fluorescent, and then added.
I still do.
This seems it's there, but it's less so. Is there something to be said there?
Well, I mean, the one thing that is this painting's taken a bit out of context because the news show that I just did in Toronto had 11 new paintings.
Right.
And I think possibly this would make a little more sense if you saw it in that group of works. Dare I say I'm becoming a more mature painter. And sometimes I don't start with fluorescent. So, you know, sometimes I have to choose what suits the painting. And this one, to get that big sky feeling, you have to have the white of the canvas radiate through the blue. So the first version of this painting, if you x-rayed this painting, you would see it actually did start with fluorescent, then it had a coat of blue, then I hated it, and I whited it out again and left it white so that I could make the blue work properly. So it was a decision that was made to suit the scene, and then kind of that's it. And then I would say maybe this painting is a little more refined than some of my other works, but I think that just might be me.
Well, that's actually what I'm kind of poking at, is that quite clearly we decided on purpose to make a different show, but in that process you started making other new work. And I have a sense that you're moving on. As opposed to you're not moving back in this opportunity to look at homecoming to Alberta. It's not like you revisited either the stories or even the ways of making. It looks like you're moving on as an artist, which I think is encouraging.
Yeah, I think so, and I think that if you also saw the Toronto show, I think it's really evident that I'm moving on. I mean, if I came back here and, well, for example, if I started painting those scenes again, I think it would be me cheating. It's like I'm not pushing myself very hard. And a big part of my practice is that I push myself really hard all the time. And so that means, for me, keeping it interesting with new narratives, new approaches. And with this painting, it was literally, I'm still attracted to the space, but I'm not at all attracted to telling that part of the story anymore. So I think that's where the change is happening. It's not happening so much materially, because materially, the material always reflects the narrative, if that makes any sense. My narrative has changed. So that kind of rambled, but I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely perfect. And I'm just still intrigued and interested in how that transforms and how you, as an art maker, have the vision and the courage and the desire to change who you are in the public. It's hard enough to get people to pay attention to you as an artist anyway, in any way, shape, or form. And then when they actually do, and then you go 180 on them. And I don't know if maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe it's not 180, but it's changed. You're not the guy who slept under a bridge.
No, God, no, not anymore. Now I'm just old and tired with 2 kids that are driving me nuts. In a good way, I love them.
So how does that? But I think what I'm getting at is that
my circumstances
have changed.
My paintings are reflecting that.
And the paintings used to be about, well, they are still about who you are. And the earlier work was about that other Kim Dorland.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the new work is definitely heading in that direction. I think that the new body of work that I just worked on for the last 6 months that I showed in Toronto is also very evident of that. And it's true. I'm not the poor kid who had a messed up life in central Alberta anymore. I'm a moderately successful artist, and I have the luxury of working on my practice all the time. So things have changed, so my paintings have changed. And I assume that they'll change again, and they'll change again.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about the four-letter word that you yourself mentioned, beauty. It interests me because, now I didn't see the Toronto show, so I'm not sure whether they are all more beautiful. But one of the intriguing things about earlier of your work, which, and some of it is upstairs, the portrait of you and Laurie, the kind of Gothic one.
Right.
I mean,
Twilight.
there was a strong kind of Gothic sense, a spectral sense to your work before, which had its own kind of beauty, but it was really about a kind of drama. And I wonder, and this is a question that you probably have to ask yourself all the time, is one of the dangers of the direction of the new work is that you're actually you could more easily fall into the beauty trap with it than you have previously. I mean, my guess is you consciously, as a strategy, would find ways to screw up the painting, if you could, to make it not pretty before.
Yes.
Are you still doing that?
Yes, every chance I get.
So in these two paintings then, Kim, where's the evidence of that?
Well, I think maybe it's not as overt as it was, but like, for example, the airbrushed lazy-ass tree in the center, right? That's the focal point of the painting, and it's the worst part. You know, for me, that's where you can add the frustration. Or if you actually pay attention to the way the architecture looks, it actually makes no sense, especially behind the cars, you know, with the tape lines on the roof in the end there, the sort of purple windows.
So the difference between the kind of lovely gestural and self-contained sense of the child in the foreground, which is so kind of wonderfully rendered, and the stupid flatness of the buildings and that palette, that's the way you screw up the painting then?
Well, I think that's how I maybe screw up the painting isn't the right word, but challenge the viewer.
Well, I was going to say something much ruder than that, but I thought you should. Okay. I mean, a different word than screw.
Yeah.
So, so when you make the decision about the rendering of the architecture, of the domestic architecture, that is a pretty crazy palette choice to make.
Yes.
Why'd you make it?
Well, I mean, that's. Why did I make it? It's always the simple questions that stump you. I don't know.
Well, why day-glow pink and that acidic yellow? And I mean, you know, now, I mean, I know some houses look like that, and those are the ones we have to burn down. But when they don't look,
Robert, clearly you didn't grow up in that neighborhood.
Yeah, that's right. Saskatoon is not much different than Medicine Hat, I suspect.
Yeah. I mean, what I would say is that it's partially considered, it's partially thought out ahead of time, like, okay, this is an area where I can confuse the viewer. Right. But part of it too just comes from the act of making, right? It just comes from working and mixing the color and seeing how it works and ruining it and starting again. So, and then, you know, the fluorescent, I don't like to think of it as a signature because I'm not that into my own myth or something, but it is definitely the most comfortable place for me to start making a work. So there's also using my own vocabulary that I've developed over many years of painting now. So it's considered, but it's a little more natural than maybe I'm making it sound, if that makes any sense. So a lot of it comes through the act of making. Like, I certainly didn't say, okay, Medicine Hat, Seymour's in the center, I've got to mess up that one, you know. A lot of it comes from the act of working.
In McMichael, the narrative that was constructed, which is both things that you had made, but also things that McMichael made, were to connect you with the narrative of the romantic tradition of the landscape. I did, and many people would, in terms of your early paintings, connect you up with the Kurt Cobain grunge dude guy. I and Robert and the audience are not in the company of the new Kim Dorland that you were talking about in terms of Toronto. I kind of get
totally. It's not a huge shift.
No, but it's, to me, it's interesting, and that is to say that people know what they can do with the McMichael construct. People know what they can do with the guy who was challenged and came back. Who is the new Kim Dorland that we're talking about?
Well, I mean, with the McMichael and this show, there were a set of decisions that were made as well. So we decided at the McMichael that it would be an interesting idea to position my work in relation to their work because it was a huge influence on my work, and it still is. Yeah. So we had to take, you know, the Kim Dorland project is quite big, so we had to take a thin piece of that and exhibit it and keep the thinking tight and straight. Right. So it's not like that work is that work and now there's this new Kim Dorland and you know what I mean? I'm still working with those ideas at the Woods, it just didn't suit this space. Yeah. So a lot of those decisions are, I mean, and then with the Toronto show, which I'm sorry to talk about a show that nobody's seen, but the other thing about Toronto is that I'm actually very well known in Toronto. People really know the language of my work in Toronto, so I can take aesthetic risks in Toronto that I probably couldn't take in another venue. Not that I, you know what I mean? I can do something new, and Toronto has followed me for long enough that I can, they'll come with me. So the new Kim Dorland, you know, I think I'm a better painter than I was 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and I think in 5 years I'll be better than I am now because I'm that kind of person. And I think narratively, you know, I've spoken about it before, but narratively I'm not so, it's not so necessary for me to look back. I think I can just look around me and I can figure out what I want to do. And the aesthetics always come along with it. Did that answer your question at all?
It certainly does. I just find it interesting because I may be overreading it, so I'm kind of pushing you to see where you're going to go with it. But you know, so much of the admiration I think for your work has in the past been to do with the bad boy. You know, the bad boy kind of notion of a troubled background, troubled stories.
The bad boy who had the father of two that has...
He's the dullest bad boy you'll ever meet.
I'm the most boring bad boy.
Eric Fischel's a bad boy, all that cocaine, man, but this is not a bad boy.
I think I see what you're trying to get at. I think you're trying to see what I think of the myth of what surrounds me.
Well, I just think that we very specifically constructed the show on purpose, almost as a change point, change point in terms of how you wanted your work viewed.
Yeah, I mean, for me, maybe it wasn't so deliberate. I just really wanted to pull my Alberta work together and have a look at it as a whole. I mean, it was really that simple. Yeah. And then, people are attracted to that story. People like hearing that I was 17 and that I was kicked out and I found true love and then I found my purpose and I made all these paintings. People like to hear that. No, and it's a true story and it's an interesting story, but it's also something that was kind of picked up from me and people ran with it. And sometimes you can't help those things. Sure. So, you know, I can only do what I do and I can give honest interviews and then people can take from that what they want.
See, there is a complicated relationship between a word that Jeffrey used, myth. I mean, one of the things about...
Am I old enough to have a myth?
No, I'm talking about the way that... I'm not talking about the way you... I don't think so. I'm talking about the way you use narrative, actually. I mean, and so that in the work that you made, which was adulatory and homage to Tom Thomson, you go two ways. You buy into both the aspects of the possible myth of Tom Thomson and his death. Shot, either falls falls out, hits his head on the side of the canoe and drowns because he's peeing off the end of it, which is in the painting, which was in the McMichael show. Or the skull found where he was buried with a axe hole in the head of it. Clearly, you know, he was killed by the husband who he was the woman he was having an affair with. So you paint out of an inherited mythology and a narrative that is possible, and that kind of fed that work. Yes. What's feeding the new work, though, and this is where the bad boy thing makes no sense at all in lots of ways, is because you're now, I mean, this is your son who you adore and you work with a lot, and so it's I mean, the myth now is a kind of a myth of domestication in a slightly larger scale. So suddenly the narrative that surrounds your life breaks down, and because what you're painting is the narrative of your real life, as opposed to some inherited one that media and including art critics are building for you.
I don't know how it happened, but there is this conception of what I'm actually like, and it's completely wrong. I did an artist talk in Baltimore, and I arrived by the plane, and I was really tired, and the woman who was sort of responsible for taking care of me is like, okay, we're gonna go to a bar. Let's go to a bar. And I'm like, it's like 11. I want to go to bed. I'm exhausted. I don't want to go to a bar. And she's like, oh, thank God. She's like, I really just thought you would be like a huge drinker. So there's this like, and I think it's because of the subject matter I use and the shit I saw, excuse my language. You know, people want to create that for you. They want to fill in the gaps. And I think that the best way to fill in the gaps is something really, really generic. And so that happens.
I mean, the real story for me is the story of your uses and abuses of the history of painting. I mean, that you're so embedded in things already made, in the making of the things you're currently making, and that dialogue is one. I mean, you wrestle with that. I mean, you're not so sure about that. I just think it's just intrinsic to the work that you're, because you're generous in your looking, and you're sort of also generous in your theft. I mean, the thing that you say is the ugliest part of that painting is the most Doigian part of that painting.
Sure, yeah. Well, Doig's a huge influence on me.
And he should be. I mean, he's huge in anybody.
He's wonderful. He's really great.
Yeah. So that's not an accusation as much as a way of trying to say, well, how does anybody today actually make a painting that can have both meaning, resonance, or matter at all? I mean, I just happen to think it mattered, but it still is a debate in some distant world of stupid criticism. You know, why do people paint? Well,
I think there's something that happens. I think that people can be lazy in their painting, and I think people can be lazy in their viewership. So people can really, let's take Doig as an example. Doig is probably right now one of the most ripped off painters out there. He's a magnificent painter. And a lot of painters really look to him and they just kind of do his thing and they do it badly and they're lazy about it and they're willing to present that. But on the other side, the viewer is often lazy and they'll say something like, that's like Peter Doig. And so they won't actually look to the painting and actually see that it's actually nothing like Doig. And I think the one thing that I always contend with, I talk to Laurie about this all the time, I'll say, is the painting too Doigy? Because I'm very conscious of that because he is a big influence of mine. Right. And I want to take something from him as I want to take something from a lot of different painters. But that's my right. Yeah. And I always work through it and turn it into my own thing. So,
and you're always playing.
And Laurie always says the same thing. She always says, "Your work looks nothing like Peter Doig." Yeah. So I don't understand. So do you know what I mean? Like, do you know what I mean by lazy viewership? Yeah. People not only will they say like, "Oh, that's just Doigy," but then they immediately dismiss the work.
Yeah. Mind you, the fact that you're playing the music constantly in your studio is not Kurt Cobain, but how much is that Doigy in the window?
He's here all week.
Wow.
He's leaving town tomorrow. Thank God. Get that guy on a plane.
That's on tape, man.
I'm sorry.
I'm so glad.
That was awesome.
I wanted to thank you, Robert, for coming here tonight.
No questions.
He leaves. But this deal, I mean, I think you're right about that, and what continues to fascinate me about your work is how actually different it continues to be in its making. I mean, actually, I don't think you do get, and that provocative question about watch out for the beauty myth for you is in fact something I think you're conscious of all the time. I just think that this shift to a subject matter which carries none of the spectral, which carries none of that sort of more dramatic quality that you had in your work. Now the drama is going to have to be created maybe out of scale. I mean, this is an earlier painting, but this is a pretty big attack piece of work, you know. Clement Greenberg is probably happily rolling in his grave and also rolling around in his grave because that's not what he thought you'd do, but these are big paintings. Is scale one of the ways you can begin to shift things?
Well, I also want to just say, I haven't stopped painting forest paintings. I haven't stopped painting the dark paintings. We just picked these paintings because they really suited the show, and the Toronto paintings we picked because I wanted a clean thought through the show. But I'm already working on a new show, and it's deep in the woods, and it's spectral, and it's ghostly. So I haven't really left that. I just got kind of interested in this for a while. Right. And I will be again, because fortunately I have more ideas than I have time. So,
and you hate the forest, which is too, I mean, you're not an outdoorsman.
no,
You've admitted
I don't hate that. I think it's beautiful, but it scares the shit out of me.
Yeah, it'll
because
kill you,
I'll die. I'll literally die. I'm not a woodsman at all. Like, it's just, I'll be dead really quickly.
Lumberjack Kim is such a nice idea.
Yeah, right.
Coveralls and
I
boots.
think people also think that of me because I did that McMichael show. Even though in every single piece of press, I spoke explicitly about how I'm not the heir to the group of 7. It was never my goal to be the heir to the group of 7. And I'm not actually woodsy at all. Like, it's not, it scares the hell out of me because I'd have no way of taking care of myself. So.
Yeah, but with the McMichael was looking at your relationship to Tom Thompson, the Group of 7,
and the Medium,
and the Hot Mush School, and all that stuff.
Yes.
And all that stuff.
No, it was a good idea, but I just
and others, including me, looked at other intermediary kinds of more obvious neo-romantic artists from Europe in terms of this. Robert has already mentioned, and I think actually, as I'm now looking at both of you, but with these two paintings in the background, the person that you're channeling is Jack Chambers, right? It's a different. It's a different thing to look at.
I mean, he's definitely somebody
for Jack Chambers.
Yeah, I've paid attention to him. I think he's a really interesting, and his domestic scenes are. Amazing. They're just
so that I mean, other than this one, which is about or seemingly relates to the 401 painting.
Yeah,
right?
the big sky.
This work here also relates in that sense to the tenderness, the incredible tenderness that Jack Chambers shows in his domestic.
And then portraits. I think the.
So I'm just interested in how fluorescent paint and that previous incarnation of who you are goes together with Kim Dorland, the father, and someone who's the loving person who paints these paintings.
Well, the one thing too, this is a painting of my oldest son, who I obviously adore, but I think that there is something in the relationship of me painting that distances me from him, so that it turns into a scene rather than, I think if I painted these saccharine, loving pictures of my children, the paintings wouldn't work. They would be cheap in some way. So what I'm really exploring is the relationship, but the complexities of that relationship. So that's where I think that's what Jack Chambers was doing. I mean, but this isn't a situation where I'm like, oh, Jack did this, so I'm taking influence. I mean, that's more of a background. I'm aware of his work and admire his work kind of thing. But I totally see the relationship. And I've also been, like Diebenkorn. I mean, there's always somebody you can, latch onto in order to discuss your own work, or So I'm not negating what you say. I'm just saying. That is not such an overt influence or method.
You haven't systematically worked through, I mean, you also did a body of work that are nudes of Laurie, which, and you've always done portraiture, and I wonder, do you ever make a kind of conscious decision to work within a genre?
Yes.
Or is that, and then does that develop?
You know what I think we're really laying out here is we need a big retrospective with everything. I think we really need to do a big retrospective with everything, so it all comes together and makes sense, maybe. But to answer your question, yes, I definitely will make that decision and say, okay, I'm going to do some old school portraits, even though they don't look old school at all.
They don't look old school. They look, you know, but they look enough like Auerbach, the painters that you also admire, who are users of thick paint. So I mean, again, it's not that we none of us spring. And I say this is a critic too, full bodied from the forehead of ourselves. I mean, we are engendered and created by our previous looking and writing as well, and I just think that's inescapable, isn't it?
Well, yeah, you have to. I mean, I've run into so many artists that just won't admit it. I'll be like, you're obviously looking at, I have one experience, it's like this person was doing work that looked just like Jeff Wall's work. It was interesting, it was nice, and it was a little bit different. I'm like, oh, so you're obviously influenced by Jeff Wall. I don't know who that is. And it's like, but you're lying. So I think that it's better to just say, yes, I'm looking at these people, because I think it makes the dialogue and the discourse more interesting.
And so this is a question that modernism asks of all artists and continues to in the Modernist Project and its inheritance, is that, does originality matter to you?
I think so. I think I'm a very original artist, yeah. I mean, I think, yes, absolutely. It's, I'm not an appropriation artist.
Right, and a postmodernist would say no, it doesn't matter. In fact, the whole point is that that the myth of originality is a problematic one. So in fact, what artists should be doing is finding ways to incrementally advance the thinking about art, but within a fairly narrow range. I mean, you actually buy into a much larger historical narrative of originality and a kind of progress, although that's an odd word to use.
Yeah, and it's such a big, the answer to that is too big for my brain to even start to put together. But I do, in a simple way, yes, I believe in originality. I don't know if I believe in this idea of advancing painting and, you know, this was the obvious choice after this, and this kind of one-point narrative doesn't work for me. I believe there's lots of different narratives. But I think within those narratives, there is still a need for originality. And I actually believe in talent, too.
And hard work. You work pretty hard. I mean, I'm always amazed going into your studio how many paintings there are.
Yes.
I mean, you seem to have a kind of self-vexing energy, like you just can't stop your...
Yeah, I mean, I don't produce as many paintings as people seem to think, especially now that I'm getting older. But one of my good friends recently told me that I paint like an athlete. And I think that's really true, because I have to keep my brain in shape to make the paintings strong, if that makes any sense.
But
I'm coming across as a really grouchy person, I think.
No, I don't think so. But I'm just very interested in how you're transforming as a painter. Robert's already mentioned it in different ways, but two huge paintings behind us that are transitional in terms of the way that you use paint. This one over here, yeah, it has some thick paint, but it's not reliant on thick paint. This one does have an undercurrent, which you can see down in this corner behind you, has a little flash of fluorescent, but really is not reliant on it. So it's amazing, like this, in terms of the scale of the paintings, how your touch and things that were so evidently who you were seems to be moving. So yeah. I think that's interesting to me. Yeah.
That's interesting for me too, because that's what makes it exciting to make work.
Yeah.
The thick paint thing too is another thing that I think people are really attracted to that. Mm-hmm. But if you actually look at the work, I'm looking down the stairs to the wooded area painting, there's actually not that much paint on that painting.
Yeah.
So the thick paint is only used where it's necessary, and it's always been that way.
Mm-hmm. And it's the painting that tells you how it needs to be made? Each painting
Yeah.
speaks to you about its own about the methodology that will be its
Yep.
making?
It's like a relationship, and you kind of go through the stages of the relationship, and the painting tells you where and what it needs.
Can the painting ever give you the wrong advice?
Yes, absolutely. And then you have to think about that advice and correct it.
Get thee behind me, Satan, satanic
Yeah.
painting.
Yes.
Should we
take questions?
We should indeed.
should.
Yeah.
It's about that time.
Or comments, or particularly answers.
Answers would be
come
awesome.
as opposed to questions. But are there thoughts out there that yeah?
Do you want to take a mic?
Yes, that would actually be wonderful.
Let's do it Phil Donahue style.
So my question, I don't know how to smile. So, question is about Jack Chambers, regionalism, Alberta, and how it all fits together.
To be blunt, that's not really a question I've ever really thought about. I mean, Jack Chambers is a nice touch point, I think, but it's not somebody who I really have overtly went after as a painter. So I don't really know what to, it's a nice comparison. I think I admire him as a painter, but I don't know if I want to throw my answer out there.
Maybe the question is one about is Chambers and regionalism, and how the London painters carved off a kind of ideology and a way of talking about painting in a national context,
Yeah.
which was as fiercely competitive as the group was in its own time. So,
Yeah, fair enough.
and I don't think that's your game. I mean, I don't think
No.
you even think about that.
No.
I mean, I'll answer the questions for him. Any other questions, just address them directly to me.
But in that same sense, since we want to put another name on it, as Greg Curnow from the same group, or from the same time and place, who prided himself on in every way about making his art be about just his everyday life. And his portraits of Sheila are in a way
I don't
quite
know his work
reminiscent.
that well. I just know the bikes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
There you go.
there you go. Wow.
Oh, there you go. We clearly couldn't have wrapped up all the thoughts. Are there other observations or questions to be made?
Something fancifully belligerent and
somebody
nasty would
yell
be
at me.
lovely. I mean, could just some insult would
That
be great.
amazing.
Yeah. I'm not kidding.
All right. Well,
Good. Well, come here.
we'll just yell them then. That's fine.
I just wanted to ask about why did you decide to do the book? There hasn't been a lot of talk about the book and why you felt this was a moment to publish and make this book.
That's a good question. Well, once the McMichael show was up, I think nobody really knew what to expect with that show. It was a weird idea. It was a lot of my work in this institution that doesn't generally do contemporary art shows. And I think after we set it up, I think we realized we had something special. And I think that the public response to it kind of marked a nice moment to maybe publish a book and collect at least a decade's worth of paintings into one place and collect our interviews and put them in one place. It felt like a nice kind of moment to do it. And we were able to get some funding, which helped. Thank you to the Royal Bank.
Yeah, and we also had the opportunity to mess with the painting again by saying that the McMichael show, which was about a specific notion, one layer of your work.
Yep.
The book could have been, quite appropriately, just that.
Yes.
It could have been a chronicle of that thought and that exhibition, but we messed with it, right? And interjected an awful lot of other ideas and thoughts into it. So that's kind of where the book comes in, as opposed to simply being a record of the McMichael exhibition and that thought. Seems to me.
No, and it was...
Richard, do you want to say something about that? No? Yeah?
Was thinking about something else I was going to ask you.
Oh, okay.
Well, one quick thing about the book. Clearly, there was a kind of juggernaut that happened, that the interest that was generated out of the McMichael show and was picked up when the Globe and Mail picked it, sort of their show as the, show of the year. And suddenly it was clear that there was a kind of mounting interest in Kim's. There's been a lot of interest in Kim's work for a number of years, but this was just one of those moments where it's the kind of positive, perfect storm. The extraordinary thing in working with the publisher we worked with was I don't think a book has come together faster anywhere. I mean, there was a joke where Jeffrey said tonight, they called him, asked if he wanted to contribute to it. He said yes. They said, you're late. That's how fast things had to get in. So this thing really, to use the phrase from Shakespeare, we really hugger-muggered this thing together in a hurry. And it's beautifully produced.
It came out beautifully.
And shockingly. I mean, my instinct as a deep-rooted pessimist was, this is never going to come together like this. And it did. And it was out, and it's a lovely book. So it's a tribute to being able to work. And it just so happened that we were all prepared to do it. And there was a moment in all of our lives when we had time to sit down and do whatever we had to do in those 4 days to get it to our publisher so it could get copy edited and all the rest of it. I mean, this is just a very unusual thing. I've worked on a lot of books in 40 years, and there's never been one that was this effortless. I don't know why. It's like, God's on his side, or the devil, actually. Yes.
Richard, do you have?
Yeah, I just have a general question. You mentioned Diebenkorn and Doig. When I first was introduced to your work, I had grown up loving Diebenkorn, and I immediately said, well, that sort of reminds me of Diebenkorn. But I can't pinpoint what it is that reminds me of Diebenkorn. And yeah, you can see a little Curnow or Doig. But it's not like that, And what I'm wondering is, are you sort of seeing the world in similar eyes, and so something of that is coming through, or is it technique, or is it something else?
I think it's the first thing. I think maybe we noticed some of the same things, and that's really what it is. It's like. I've lost my train of thought. It's not about taking the ingredients and putting them together. It's about me and my filter. And I want to be generous about acknowledging influence, because I think it's important. And all of the important artists that I look at are generally pretty, where would Willem de Kooning be without Arshil Gorky?
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? Like, that was a direct relationship. And without Gorky, de Kooning couldn't really have existed, but then did he ever exist? So it's, I just want to be generous about that. And sometimes, especially tonight, maybe that was a mistake. But it's not about taking a little of this, a pinch of that, and putting it together. It's just, it's coming through me, but I'm trying to give my shout out to different.
Yeah, and I think you do it magnificently. I mean, if you remember the fabulous story about Gorky, he was challenged by some of his contemporaries who just said, "Dude, I mean, all you're doing is you're redoing Miro," and Gorky's reply was, "Oh, is there somebody better? It was somebody else I should have been doing instead." And what I think Robert remarked about before, which I would also reiterate, is that I think what is lovely about the work is that in as well as the challenge that your work throws down, it does pay homage and respectful attention to other people, but not like, I think I can do that too. But as we look out on the world, maybe you're not the most observant person about the suburbs. Maybe you're not the most observant person about the woods, but you're probably a very observant person about people who admire art and those subjects through art. And so to look at the world as art rather than out to Medicine Hat or Mississauga or whatnot, is to find power in art to inspire the world. And
or tell stories. Yeah,
tell stories.
Yeah, and painting obviously is both. It's about a subject, but it's also always a pavement of citations. I mean, the road that painters travel down is always the road that, in the best and richest sense, has already been traveled. I mean, it was a funny thing today because I hadn't seen this painting before. It's a new painting, and when I looked at the shadow coming off of the young boy, I distinctly, because I've looked so closely at Eric Fischl, there's a very famous Eric Fischl painting of a young girl in bed standing with a young boy, and he's standing at the back, and in the room that they're in are African sculptures. And the African sculpture casts a shadow like that. And when I pointed that out to you, because you know Eric's work really well, it suddenly dawned on you, well, maybe that's possible, although it's also possible that it's Emily Carr. Yeah. So all I'm getting at is that the road that we all go down as makers and lookers is one that is constantly being inhabited by the ghosts of that painting tradition. And I actually think that's what makes painting the art that is always going to be a cat that's got more than 9 lives. It's just never going to go away. It's always a phoenix. It just keeps resurrecting itself from whatever ashes the critics of painting have been able to put it in. It's a hatefully conservative view, by the way, that I'm saying.
Well, no, but I am wondering if there's room for to take the conversation in a slightly different direction. I'm finding a lot of this very intellectual and academic. And for me, my response to the painting is a feeling. It's particularly I don't know if it's capturing the emotional something about growing up in the suburbs. I don't know if it's because we're similar age or have a similar background. But to me, there's violence, there's confronting violence, there's calm, there's the sort of sterile, how things felt. So to me, all of the references and the techniques of other artists, the materiality, is serving the purpose of the feeling. So I'm just wondering if there's any room for that.
Aren't you a breath of fresh air? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ultimately, that's kind of what I've been trying to get to is ultimately, I'm trying to tell stories through my work. And the best short story, the best stories use words and text to create that kind of emotional response. And that's totally what I'm trying to do. You just said it better than me. Thank you so much.
It's nice to hear from a Cartesian every once in a while, where those things get so separated out from one the other. See, I agree with you, and the thing that I find heartbreaking about this painting is the curve of his right leg. It turns in, and the back of his head. And anybody who has children and remembers what they were like at that age, it just breaks your heart because they're going to grow up and be just like us. And so that's depressing. But that moment of perception of that gesture is it's a killer for me, you know.
Yeah, for me, that painting is all about the shadow because you see his shoulders, and it's this moment where he had a toy in his hand, and the only way that you can recognize that is when you look at the shadow. So it's really about that moment, about seeing my child, but you're different people. So there's I don't know, I always thought when I was a father, you would like really know your child, but ultimately you don't know them at all because they're different people. So there's that kind of melancholy or despair to parenting. So that's kind of what they were, most of these sort of more recognizable is not the right word, realistic paintings were more about that relationship.
Following on that question, melancholy is an interesting word. There is a side to your work which is deeply rooted in the melancholic.
Yes.
And isn't there?
Yeah, because it's just what I'm like. Yeah. And it's the thing I hate about myself the most, but what are you going to do?
Right. Right. Brighten up, lad.
Yeah, right? I wish.
But yeah. Go ahead. No, please go ahead. No,
Please.
go ahead.
I guess seeing you here tonight in this environment, I can see that you're not a woodsman.
Yeah.
Oddly, I was surprised to hear that. I love your wood. I think that uncomfortableness in the woods is interesting. I'm just wondering, in particular, your time just post Emma Lake experience. Maybe if you want to touch on your time in Emma Lake, and
Sure.
those are wonderful paintings post Emma Lake, and I'm just wondering if you want to elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that was an amazing experience where that was the first time I ever actually plein air painted. It was interesting because I knew the history of the lake. I don't think the lake is what it once was as a sort of intellectual hotspot. I mean, the first person that they brought was Barnett Newman, who, I mean, could you imagine? Like Clement Greenberg was there. A lot of these really interesting thinkers about painting, which actually had a radical effect on Canada's history with the Regina Five. Mm-hmm. That's right? Yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah. So anyway, I kind of wanted to put myself in that situation and really gather that experience. But I also really wanted to try to understand the physical space and the sort of, it's tacky when you feel it, but when you're at the lake, it feels awesome. And so it's like trying to capture that feeling in paintings. But my relationship to the woods, I think, is reflected in my work. Chris Hampton wrote a piece called "The Woods Are Where You'll Die" about my work and my relationship to the work, and sort of, I always tried to make it really clear that I'm not a woodsman when I described that work, because I'm not trying to cheat people in their viewing. So.
The workshop leader at Emma Lake, by the way, before Barnett Newman and Will was actually Jack Shadwell.
Oh, that's
And the roots of Emma Lake were Henderson and a lot of Canadian painters. It gets turned into a beachhead for post-penalty abstraction through the Greenberg thing, but it actually has a much richer history than that. And then subsequent to all the Americans coming up, I mean, you were a workshop leader there, for heaven's sake.
I was. I think Chris Cran was before me. Yeah. No, I think they've reopened it.
Those shoes will get in one of his paintings.
Thank you very much for being here today and for the book launch. My question, I want to kind of redirect the conversation out of this space and out of everything you've probably talked about so far, and focusing in on your voted most likely show, which is at the other location. And I was wondering if you could talk about your process for curating, if it's interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary practice, and how you find a balance between the two.
Well, first and foremost, I'm not a curator at all. So, and I just want to say that out of respect for curators who've worked at it for a very long time. I'm not just going to show up and I'm a curator too. But the initial curating I did was I did this show called I Heart Paint in Toronto, and it was just really about I just wanted to make a show that I would want to see. And I've made a few contacts over the years, so it was nice to reach out to some people, and they helped with the curation. So every time I asked them asked them to join the show, I would say, who are you looking at? And I would try to get that person into the show. So it was that was kind of my method of working. So when Jeffrey came to me and said, what would you think about this idea, which was actually Nate McLeod's idea, I said, yes, I can do another I Heart Paint show. And then it turned out Calgary is a completely different scene than I expected. And initially, I won't lie, it scared the shit out of me because I didn't understand it at all. So what was really amazing about that is, from an outsider's perspective, I actually got to take a crash course on what Calgary's like. I'm sure I missed many people. I'm sure that I barely scratched the surface, but I do feel very proud of the show I put together. Yeah.
I should have made this comment earlier, but I've been too engrossed in the conversation. As one of the woodsmen from the McMichael, the gallery in the forest, I just thought I should mention that while we have historically been very focused on traditional Canadian art, your exhibition has almost ushered in a new age for the gallery. We're redirecting and we're now focusing on, well, not focusing, but looking into more contemporary. And I think it's going to be an interesting few years for the McMichael now that we've had the success with your show and we know where we can go with contemporary Canadian.
Oh,
so
that's great.
Just thought that bore mentioning.
Yeah, it was a thrill to do that show. It was really fun. Okay.
Yeah, that's it. I think that's a wrap, but I just wanted to step back up here and do the thank yous. So I need to thank Burnett, Duckworth, and Palmer for our exhibition sponsor. I'd like to thank Shaw, our friends at Shaw that are here doing the videotaping, and for Theatre Junction Grand, who lent us the risers. I'd like to thank Richard Nadeau from Figure One Publishing and Steve Jacobs from McMichael that have flown out here for this evening. I'd like to thank you for being here tonight, for being interested in art, for coming out and supporting Contemporary Calgary, and I would like to thank our distinguished speakers. Let's give them a hand. So they will be over at the far table to sign some books, and the bar is now open. Thank you very much.
Thank God.
I took this book, by the way, this is your book, not mine. I like to put it in the box.